Since the beginning of time, mankind has marveled at the heavens, studying and prophesizing all that lies beyond our home here on planet Earth. We have created stories, theories, and even religions to help explain the unknowns of the universe. But not until recently have we actually traveled beyond our atmosphere to see space for ourselves. In 1947, the world entered into a period known as the Cold War. Each armed with a new weapon, the atomic bomb, both the United States and the Soviet Union had reached a stalemate. Neither could act without the risk of retaliation from the other side, creating a situation of mutual assured destruction. Thus, each state began their own search for an advantage and began developing rockets to launch their new bombs from around the world. The movement to begin working towards space started in 1952 when the International Council of Scientific Unions established that July 1, 1957 through December 31, 1958 would be the International Geophysical Year due to the high points of solar activity cycles during that time period. In doing so, the Council also declared that all artificial satellites should be launched during this time frame. On December 17, 1954, Chief Soviet rocket scientist Sergei Korolev proposed a developmental plan for an artificial satellite, emphasizing that the launch of an orbital satellite was inevitable in the development of rocket technology. Not to be outdone, the United States in 1955 declared their intention of launching an Earth-orbiting satellite of their own during the International Geophysical Year. After requests from various government agencies to fulfill the task, the duty of satellite creation and launch was assigned to the Naval Research Laboratories Vanguard in September of 1955. October 4, 1957 is the day that the first man-made object was successfully launched into orbit. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. The successful launch of this satellite brought great controversy to the United States. The citizens and government were worried about Soviet capabilities as their launch signaled their potential to conduct a nuclear attack on the United States. It was also with this launch that the United States government approved funding for the creation of another satellite of its own, which thus began the Explorer project. The Explorer project had two major parts that needed to be completed. The first was to create a satellite, and the second being the creation of a rocket capable of putting the satellite in orbit. The U.S. Naval Research Laboratory was assigned to this task, and the program was named Project Vanguard. The goal was to have the project nicknamed TV-3, which was the Vanguard rocket carrying Explorer 1 off the ground during the month of September 1957. However, due to delays, it was finally launched in December that year. The launch was a disaster. The rocket lifted about 4 feet off the ground before it lost thrust and fell back to the Earth in a giant explosion, earning it the nicknames Kaputnik, Flopnik, Puffnik, and Stay Putnik. It was finally determined that this failure was due to a ruptured fuel line, and preventative measures were put in place for the later rockets. Soon after, in an effort to save face, the US launched another, smaller rocket to get the Explorer 1 into orbit. Explorer 1 did go on to discover the magnetic radiation belts that surround Earth, but at this time it was too late. The Russians had already had multiple satellites in orbit, and the overall achievement was trivial. On March 17, 1958, the Project TV-4 in the Vanguard satellite was successfully launched into a stable orbit and remains the oldest human-made satellite in orbit to this day. In response to the space race that quickly unfolded, the United States also took a political approach alongside their scientific approach. Due to the success of the Sputnik launches and the Explorer 1 launch, the government wanted to devise an agency with the sole responsibility of furthering the work of the space race. This led to Congress's passing of the National Aeronautics and Space Act, otherwise known just as the Space Act, in July of 1958. This act led directly to the formation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, from conjugation of other government agencies as of October 1958. Following up the Soviet successful launch and recovery of the Sputnik 2 and its passenger, it was decided that putting a human into space was the next step. Thus, the Vostok program was born. The Vostok was a small spherical spacecraft capable of carrying one crew member and their necessities for flight. The Vostok 1 was first launched on April 12, 1961, and carried Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. The flight took 108 minutes and made Gagarin the first human to leave the atmosphere and orbit Earth. After NASA's establishment in 1958, the first major project left the ground in May 1961. 3 weeks after the Soviets successfully sent a man to space, the American Alan Shepard did the same aboard the Freedom 7, except he did not orbit the Earth, he merely went up and back down. Although the pride in his accomplishment was dampened due to its late date, Alan Shepard did ride the capsule all the way to the ground, something that was not achieved by the Soviets as Yuri Gagarin ejected himself 20,000 feet above the ground and parachuted the rest of the way. A year after the Soviet Union put a human into orbit, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Glenn completed 3 orbits and splashed down safely in the Atlantic Ocean. After the flight, John Glenn became a national hero. He received a ticker tape parade in New York City, and President Kennedy escorted him in a parade at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, where he awarded Glenn with the NASA Service Medal. Obviously apparent to the American people that the Soviets were winning the space race, it became necessary to create a long-term plan to beat the Soviets. The 2 choices for this plan were to either build a space station or to send a man to the moon.
Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
In August of 1962, the Soviet Union launched the Vostok 3 and Vostok 4. The 2 launches showed the Soviets' ability of 24-hour launch pad turnaround, as well as flight path consistency, as both were launched in nearly identical orbits. The Vostok 4 also went on to set a record at the time by spending 4 days in space. The Vostok 5 and 6 soon followed and duplicated the 24-hour turnaround feat. In 1967, the United Nations passed the Outer Space Treaty. This treaty was designed to prevent competitive colonization and damage of celestial bodies. Work on the treaty began in 1959 before the launch of Sputnik 1. The United States and Soviet Union both exchanged proposals or restrictions on the use of space between 1959 and 1962. 1967 also marks the first attempted launch of the Apollo program. Apollo 1 was advancing toward its first piloted flight. Unfortunately, tragedy struck on January 27, 1967, when a flash fire in the rocket's command module killed all 3 astronauts. After extensive continued research, the Apollo program attempted another manned flight launch on October 11, 1968. Apollo 7 was the last launch using the Saturn 1B rocket. This flight held the astronauts in orbit for nearly 11 days, a time longer than all Soviet orbits combined up to that time. Apollo 7 also marked advancements in crew comfort, as hot meals and larger areas for movement greatly improved conditions for the astronauts. The Apollo missions that followed were launched to collect data for the final lunar landing. Apollo 8's flight, called Christmas at the Moon as it took place on Christmas Eve, orbited the moon and collected photographic data for NASA researchers. Apollo 9's flight tested the hardware that was to be used in the lunar landing, as well as human responsiveness and control in low gravity. Apollo 10 played through nearly every step of the lunar landing, excluding the landing itself. This flight brought astronauts within 14 kilometers of the lunar surface before returning to Earth. After about 12 years of hard work, Apollo 11, the first manned mission to the moon, was launched on July 16, 1969. It took 4 days for Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin to land on the moon. An estimated 530 million people watched as the United States made history.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. I'm going to step off the limb. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.